Hello all you Pixel people, I am Pixel and welcome to your news bit for September the 17th, 2013. Today is my birthday, I am 27 and I have to admit that today's story kind of feels a bit like fate. Yesterday the big man Gabe Newell himself announced during LinuxCon 2013 that Valve will announce some details on the hardware that they have been working on within the next week. It seems pretty obvious to me that this is going to be the Steam box, and we know this because it's been teased for like forever. I cannot help but think that the timing of this is actually very well calculated. Getting some hype out before the release of the next generation of consoles, i.e. the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One, could mean that they are able to convince some people to hold off purchasing one of them consoles and wait for Valve's entry instead. Not sure, but it's always a possibility. Obviously, this also gets me really excited. However, it is important to be careful not to expect the world on a plate, because at this point we really don't know what to expect, to be honest. What we do know is it is highly likely to be running on Linux by default. However, we do not know if it means that it will be impossible to install Windows, or if a Windows version would also be released alongside, obviously with the premium of paying for the operating system itself. As of today, Steam has 198 games that will install and run natively on Linux. However, it's important to note that very few of these will come under the category of, you know, your typical AAA big bad boy shooters. It was also mentioned that Valve are working with some other game developers to make tools that will enable Linux development to become much easier. I suppose that it really comes down to, can Valve convince some of the big boy developers to release Linux versions of their games? I don't know, only time will tell. Okay, so with all that said, I thought that I would kind of give you guys some of my opinions on what I would personally like to see from the Steam box. I mean, I'm a PC gamer. I sit at my computer most days and I play games, I record videos on here and everything, and upload them to YouTube and all that kind of good stuff. And I'm not 100% certain that the Steam box would really appeal to me in many ways. I mean, I think it's really interesting, such as I've got a son which I could purchase that for him and he could play it on his TV at home. And also all the other people which used to be into PC gaming years ago, which have just kind of fell off the grid, maybe got a console because they went to get their normal 9-to-5 job and they just don't have the time to put into PC gaming, because unfortunately, as much as we all like to claim the elitist card, we have to admit sometimes PC gaming can be a little bit more time consuming than simply sticking in a disc into a console and playing away. So I kind of think that that's where the Steam box has got to be directed if it's going to be successful, because, for instance, I've got a massive 48-inch TV in the next room to me, and it's got it's full HD, I've got the surround sound set up, and most of the time I am here on my own. It's a detached house, so I could have the sound as loud as I like. Yeah, almost everything I watch sat at my computer desk with my headphones on my 27-inch screen. So, yeah, I think trying to convince PC gamers to leave their bedrooms, their offices, or whatever to game in the living room is not really going to be the goal, or even possible for Valve to convince people to do. However, I definitely see it becoming useful for LAN events in future. So, if you're a competitive gamer and you're going to be traveling around the country or the world playing games competitively, then if you had a small, almost console-sized box which will allow you to plug in a mouse and keyboard and play around the world really simply just by plugging it into a monitor, then I think you've got a bit of an audience there. I would also consider having it as a secondary, maybe next to my computer, so if I have friends around or anything like that, we can sit down and play that. One thing that I think people are kind of ignoring right now is that there's all this talk about Valve and hardware. I personally think that we are much more likely to see an Nvidia Shield style device from Valve before we see a out-and-out console. And what I mean by this is, I would like to see a controller which has got built-in wireless streaming capabilities, which would allow you to go downstairs and play your game by streaming it from your normal PC to your TV completely wirelessly just by activating it. Obviously, you've got some issues with how does it stream to the TV? I mean, you can get streaming technology for TVs, but you need to plug something into it. I mean, in future, I could imagine most smart TVs having this functionality built into them from the factory, so many devices will be able to take control of your TV without having to plug anything additional in, maybe just adding a little password to it so you can then take control. I think a controller is likely going to be the hardware they announce, as much as I would love them to announce a console style Steam box. But don't get me wrong, it is still possible. I mean, this was at a Linux convention that this was announced, so it's definitely going to be something Linux related. What I did mention in the little bit of a news story that I mentioned before I went on to my opinions was that not many of the games that are Linux compatible right now are classed as your big AAAs. You've got your Killing Floor, you've got your Left 4 Dead 2, you've got Steam itself, and you've got many indie games which are now running on Linux. However, if this is going to work out, Valve really need to convince developers to create games for Steam which will run via Linux. This may seem virtually impossible. At first it was running through my head and I was like, how can you do this? How are you going to make this work? But then I realized if they just built Source 2, the engine, with native compatibility to Linux, and then also gave out very cheap licenses, or maybe even free licenses to any developer which will release a Linux version, then that could be quite promising, because we know that the Source engine is really quite powerful. It's getting a little bit old now, but you cannot deny that Portal 2 still looks great. Left 4 Dead 2, even though it doesn't look realistic, still looks great. And then coming out very soon, including on the Xbox One, we have got Titanfall, which is running a highly modified version of Source, which looks very next gen and very impressive. So I think that just goes to show that it is physically possible to make a very pretty game on the current Source engine. And as we already know through many leaks and even confirmation, I do apologise, and even confirmation from Gabe Newell himself, they are working on Source 2, so if that's a possibility, then that could be very interesting. I suppose after you convince, well, Valve's already doing it, so after Valve, the next person that you really need to convince is Epic Games to create native Linux support for the Unreal Engine, and then maybe Crytek for the Crytek engine, or the Cry engine should I say. I mean, there's still loads of littler engines which you really need to take into account before you can actually say, yeah, it'll definitely work. But I think once a couple of the big boys, i.e. the Unreal Engine, Cry Engine and Source, do something, I think it's only natural that most other engine manufacturers and developers will follow suit, to be honest. It was kind of interesting that during the keynote speech, he did mention that only 1% of people play games on Linux, which is actually still quite a high number. I mean, if a game developer could sell 1%, a game to 1% of the whole world that plays games, that's still an awful lot of copies. But we definitely need to get that risen up to at least 30%. I think if you reach that 30%, that is when it becomes viable. If you get some nice AAAs on a 30% PC market share, it could be very promising. But only time will tell if this will work. Personally, I think it's a massive risk, and I'm kind of glad that Valve are going to take the risk, because somebody needs to, right? One thing that I would like to point out, this is like a secondary kind of thing. They mentioned that they went to Nvidia to try and fix drivers during the keynote speech when they was converting over to Linux. This is more than likely because the Nvidia cards were having issues when it was over in Linux. But if you go onto the Steam software right now and you scroll down, you will see that featured partners, AMD is a featured partner. And AMD is in the next generation of consoles. Is this bad news for Nvidia? I wonder. Or is that AMD thing going to get dropped, and maybe that's why Nvidia decided to turn down the console manufacturers when it came to giving a good quote for their business. And maybe we could see the Linux box powered by Nvidia. That would be interesting, right? That would be very interesting. Anyway, guys, I hope that you've enjoyed this video. It's just a really quick one. I thought that the news was actually kind of interesting, and I'm personally very excited for it. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to slap that like button. And if you are new around here, don't forget to slap that subscribe button for some more PC gaming / Steambox gaming goodness. I am Pixel. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time. Bye bye.
Alert! The final control point is being contested.